Okay. Listener name. You really threw us a curveball this time with these documents you sent over.
Oh,
Yeah, some legal paperwork. And
okay.
well, let's just say this isn't your typical property dispute.
Yeah, this one is pretty captivating because we're looking at the sale of a former NATO property
Hmm.
in Germany, governed by the state succession deed 1998.
Sounds pretty standard, right?
You'd think so,
Yeah.
but here's where things take a turn. There are some really unusual clauses in this deed.
Riz?
Clauses that, when you consider this whole network of international agreements, well, there's an argument to be made that this sale could have implications far beyond just a single property in Germany.
So what are we talking about here? Like, what's the core of this argument?
Well, the crux of it all revolves around what you might call the domino effect,
Hmm.
or a chain reaction triggered by the sale of this property as a unit.
Okay.
It all comes down to connected networks.
Connected networks. Okay, I'm listening.
So imagine, those domino rallies? You tip over one domino, and it starts this whole chain reaction, bringing down the entire line.
Okay, I get the domino analogy, but how does a real estate sale in Germany turn into a global domino rally?
Well, this particular NATO property was tied into the German public utilities grid.
Okay.
The sale, with its development as a unit clause, basically extends ownership along those connected networks.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that whoever bought this property might also own a piece of the German power grid?
That's exactly what some are arguing, and it gets even more complex because that German grid is linked to neighboring European countries.
Okay.
Think the European electricity grid, for example.
I see.
So the ripple effect just expands outward, domino by domino.
Okay, so from one property, we're potentially talking about a big chunk of Europe.
Potentially.
But how does that cross continents?
That's where submarine cables come into play.
Okay.
Those underwater information highways that connect continents.
Right.
The argument is that the sale of the property and its connected network could potentially extend ownership to these cables.
So that's how we jump across the Atlantic.
Precisely.
Okay, my brain is starting to hurt a little bit here.
Yeah.
You're saying that owning a piece of land connected to the grid could lead to owning cables running under the Atlantic? I mean, how is that even remotely possible?
Well, the sources we're looking at present a pretty compelling case.
Okay.
They argue that this whole domino effect is amplified by NATO's integration with the UN.
Now, I remember reading about that integration, but how does that make things even more complicated?
Well, think about it as the domino effect captures NATO countries. It automatically captures UN countries.
Okay.
Because NATO acts on behalf of the UN, it's deeply integrated into the UN's structure. So it creates this chain reaction across a whole web of international agreements and treaties.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this straight. We've got the sale as a unit spreading through interconnected networks like power grids, maybe even submarine cables.
Right.
And then NATO's connection to the UN adds another whole layer of complexity.
Exactly. And there's another fascinating deal.
Oh, there's more.
This development as a unit clause.
Yeah.
It isn't just limited to directly connected networks.
Wait, what does that even mean?
So imagine a gas pipeline
Okay.
that doesn't physically touch the power grid, but it overlaps in an area that's been sold as part of this network.
Okay.
Guess what? It becomes part of the deal, too.
So even if something isn't directly plugged in, if it's in the same geographical area, it gets swept up in this sale.
Exactly.
It's like a legal black hole or something.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, this level of complexity is what makes this whole thing so mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And potentially so far-reaching.
Absolutely.
It's like, we're talking about a game of legal dominoes, but the entire world is the playing field.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of networks, I found the role of telecommunications in all of this to be especially interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The sources mentioned a 1995 license agreement with a company called TKS Telepost.
Right, TKS Telepost is a subsidiary of Vodafone.
Right.
They provided services to military bases all over the world. And this is where things get really interesting, because it potentially brings those global military communication networks into the mix.
So it's not just physical infrastructure like power grids and cables, but also communication lines. I mean, the scope of this is just incredible.
It is.
And there's another detail that really stood out to me. The sale happened before Germany's telecommunications privatization.
Right, and that's a crucial detail, because the sources raise the question. Were state-owned telecom networks essentially sold off before they were even private?
Hmm.
It adds a whole other layer of legal complexity to the situation.
Okay, so we talked about submarine cables connecting continents. But
Yeah.
how exactly do they fit into this potential global sale?
Well, the theory is that this domino effect could potentially transfer ownership along any connected network.
Hmm.
And submarine cables are essentially the backbone of global communications.
Yeah.
And there would physically link the continents together through this vast network under the ocean.
So owning a piece of land connected to this vast network could theoretically give you a claim to parts of the network itself.
That's the argument.
It's like owning a piece of the internet.
It's a bold claim, and one that raises some serious legal questions.
No kidding. It's like each network connection triggers the next one, expanding the reach of this sale further and further. I'm starting to see why you called this a domino effect.
Yeah.
It's a chain reaction with potentially global consequences.
And there's another crucial piece to this whole puzzle, NATO's Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA. This agreement grants NATO some unique privileges.
Like what?
Things like the right to determine the location and size of military bases and control over critical communication infrastructure.
Wait, are you saying that the sources are suggesting that these rights might have been transferred to the buyer of this property?
That's the theory,
Wow.
that through the sale of the property and the connected networks, the buyer potentially gained control over military networks all over the world.
It's a pretty audacious concept.
It is.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp the sheer scope of this. We've gone from a seemingly straightforward property sale to a scenario where potentially the entire world was sold.
Yeah,
All because of this chain reaction across connected networks.
right.
But what does this actually mean from a legal standpoint?
That's where things get really fascinating.
Okay.
Let's dive into some of the potential legal ramifications, starting with the 12-month no-objection rule from the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that rule mean in plain English?
Essentially, under international law, countries have a specific window of time to formally object to a treaty or agreement.
Okay.
If they don't object within that time frame, it's considered tacit agreement. They've essentially agreed by staying silent.
So are the sources arguing that by not formally objecting to this sale, countries around the world might have tacitly agreed to the sale of, well, everything?
It's one of the arguments they're putting forward. And it leads to some really interesting legal questions. Did countries fully comprehend the potential ramifications of this sale?
Yeah.
Did they even know about this 12-month window?
And what about the buyer? I mean, what kind of legal power could they potentially have if this theory is actually true?
Well, the sources suggest that by owning these global networks, the buyer could gain jurisdiction over international telecommunications disputes.
Whoa. You mean they could potentially control who gets access to the internet, what data is shared, and how international communications are regulated?
It's a possibility, and it raises serious concerns about censorship, data privacy, and the very future of the internet.
It's like this one real estate deal could completely overturn how we think about the internet communications and global power.
It's a lot to consider.
It really is. We've covered a lot of ground just in this first part.
We have.
From what seemed like a straightforward property sale to the potential restructuring of global power.
And we're just getting started.
Yeah.
In part 2, we'll explore the concept of a clean slate. This idea that the buyer might be completely free from all pre-existing obligations.
Okay.
It's both fascinating and terrifying.
I have a feeling my brain is going to need a break after all of this, but I definitely want to hear more. Let's take a quick pause, and we'll be right back with part 2 of this incredible story.
Sounds good.
Okay. Listener name part 1 definitely left us with way more questions than answers.
It did.
I mean, we went from a property sale in Germany to potentially the entire world being owned by one entity.
It's a lot to process.
All thanks to this crazy domino effect across interconnected networks.
Right.
My head is still spinning.
Yeah, and as we go deeper into these sources,
Yes.
we uncover even more questions.
You know, one concept that really stuck with me was that clean slate idea.
Oh, yeah?
What does that even mean in this context?
So it's this legal argument suggesting that if the buyer now theoretically owns the world, they're free from any pre-existing obligations.
Okay.
Think of it like hitting reset on international relations, treaties, debts, everything.
So you're saying we could be looking at a world with borders, laws, or agreements.
Potentially.
That's both kind of terrifying and exhilarating at the same time.
Yeah, the sources suggest this scenario where the buyer could hypothetically just dictate new rules their own systems of governance, and even redefined what national sovereignty means.
So it challenges like everything we know about the world order.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. I'm trying to wrap my head around all of this. If this clean slate concept is actually valid, what happens to things like international debts and treaties' existing agreements?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it brings up all sorts of ethical and political dilemmas.
Yeah.
Do they inherit the world's problems along with its assets? Or do they start fresh, leaving all that baggage behind?
And what about things like environmental regulations, human rights treaties, or international trade agreements? Are those just wiped clean?
It's not so cut and dry. The sources don't have all the answers. But they do make us think, could this lead to a more equitable world order? One without these outdated, potentially harmful agreements? Or would it just create total chaos and instability on a global scale?
It's like a giant thought experiment with the fate of the world hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine what a clean slate would mean in practice.
It's
I mean, would existing laws even be enforceable? Would countries still have any real power?
those are questions that would be debated for years, if not decades.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond the legal and political ramifications, too.
What do you mean?
Think about the potential cultural and societal shifts.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right. What happens to our individual cultures, our languages, our traditions?
Exactly.
Would we see a homogenization of culture under a single global power structure? Or would totally new forms of cultural expression emerge in response to this totally unprecedented situation?
It's uncharted territory for sure.
Yeah.
This whole deep dive has made me question everything I thought I knew about how the world works.
Me too. It's exhilarating and terrifying all at the same time.
I know.
But let's maybe bring it back down to earth a little bit.
Good.
Back to the legal arguments and the sources.
Sure.
You mentioned the Vienna Convention and that 12-month no objection rule earlier. Can you talk a bit more about the practical implications of that rule?
Sure.
Like, have there been any examples in the past where countries missed this window and it had big consequences?
Well, the Vienna Convention, it's essentially a rule book for international treaties.
Okay.
And that no objection rule, it's a key part of it. It's there to make sure countries have a fair chance to review and potentially object to any international agreement that might affect them.
Okay.
If a country doesn't object within that 12-month window, it's assumed they've consented to the agreement even if they weren't actively involved in the negotiations.
So in this case, are the sources saying that countries maybe missed their chance to object to this sale?
Right.
And by doing so, they accidentally agreed to this transfer of global ownership.
That's essentially their argument.
Wow.
Now, whether countries were even aware of this sale and what it could potentially mean,
Right.
that's debatable.
Yeah.
But the legal framework is there.
That raises another question. What if a country comes forward now and says, hold on, we didn't agree to this, we object, is it too late?
That's where things get really messy.
Yeah.
International law is complex.
Yeah.
There's a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
There's no simple answer to that question. It would likely lead to a huge legal battle in international courts with arguments and counter-arguments from every side.
This little situation is like a legal thriller, but on a global scale.
It kind of is.
But beyond all the legal stuff,
Yeah,
there are real practical things to consider.
absolutely. If this theory holds up, and we're talking about a massive shift in power,
Yeah.
not just between countries, but between individuals and this new global entity.
Which brings us back to the clean slate idea. The idea that this buyer might be free from all pre-existing obligations.
Right.
It begs the question, what does a clean slate actually mean? Does it mean a world without any rules or regulations?
It's not necessarily about having no rules, but about the possibility of creating entirely new ones.
Okay.
Imagine the buyer decides to implement a global system of governance with its own laws, regulations, and enforcement.
A whole new world order created by one entity.
Right.
That's a lot of power for one person or organization to have. What would stop them from abusing that power?
That's the most important question. And it's one that the sources don't fully address. They make a good case for how this sale could have happened,
Right.
but they leave us to figure out the potential consequences.
So listener name, this is where we need your help.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on everything we've talked about so far? What questions would you ask to learn more? This is truly uncharted territory.
It is. This situation needs critical thinking and careful consideration.
Absolutely.
We need to look at the evidence, weigh the arguments, and come to our own conclusions.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. We've gone from a property sale to the potential collapse of nations and this idea of a world under single ownership. And there's one last piece of this puzzle to explore.
Okay.
The ramifications of this clean slate. and what it means for the future of our planet. We'll get into that in part 3 of this incredible deep dive. Well, listener name, welcome back to the final part of this deep dive.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I have never encountered anything quite like this.
It's pretty unique.
We started with a property sale in Germany, and now we're talking about the potential sale of the entire world.
That's a big jump.
It really is. The implications are just mind-blowing.
It really makes you rethink things.
It does. It makes you rethink everything we thought we knew about sovereignty, property rights, the structure of our global society.
Absolutely.
So in parts 1 and 2, we talked about how this sale could have happened.
Right.
We went over the domino effect across networks, the whole clean slate concept, the potential legal ramifications.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
But now I think we have to confront the biggest question of all. What happens next?
That's the question, isn't it? And honestly, nobody knows for sure,
Right.
but we can explore some possible scenarios.
Okay, let's do that. So let's imagine for a minute that this theory is actually true, that one entity now owns the world. What does that mean for the future of nations, for humanity as a whole?
Well, that's a question that raises so many more questions.
Yeah.
Would governments still be around?
Right.
Would borders even matter anymore? Would we see one global government?
And what about individual rights and freedoms? Would those be protected, or would they disappear under this new world order?
Those are really important questions. And unfortunately, the sources we've been looking at don't really have clear answers. They explain how this situation might have happened,
Right.
but they leave us to deal with the what-ifs.
You know, I keep thinking about the clean slate concept. It's such a powerful idea, but it's also a little scary.
It is.
If this buyer really is free from any past obligations, what's to stop them from just imposing their own rules and values on the whole world?
It's a valid concern, and
Yeah.
it highlights why we need to be thinking critically about this. We can't just accept this theory without questioning it. We need to look at the evidence, think about the buyer's motivations, and consider other interpretations.
Like, for example, is it possible that this sale was just a mistake?
Maybe
A bureaucratic oversight that had these crazy unintended consequences?
it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe there's something more sinister going on.
That's a good point. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
We do. We need to approach this whole thing with a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm also wondering about what happens to international organizations like the UN.
Oh, yeah.
If one entity owns the world, do these institutions just disappear? Or do they somehow become part of this new world order?
It's hard to say how existing power structures would adapt to this kind of radical change.
Yeah.
Maybe there would be a period of chaos and conflict as different groups fight for control. Or maybe there would be more of a collaborative approach,
Yeah.
with the buyer working with international organizations to establish a new global framework.
I think it's important to remember that there could be both good and bad outcomes here.
Definitely.
On the one hand, this could lead to global chaos and people losing their rights.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it could also open up opportunities for new ideas, cooperation, a fairer distribution of resources.
It's important to avoid those simple stories of utopia or dystopia.
Right.
Reality is always much more complicated than that.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals when faced with this kind of monumental shift?
Well, first of all, we have to stay informed
Okay.
and be critical thinkers.
Yeah.
Ask tough questions,
Yeah.
demand transparency, hold those in power accountable.
It's a good reminder that we can't just sit back and let things happen to us.
Exactly.
We need to be part of shaping the future.
We do. And we're not alone in this. There are people and organizations all over the world fighting for peace, justice, and sustainability.
That's a good point. By working together, sharing information, we can try to navigate this uncertain future and hopefully create a better world. Listener name, this deep dive has been a journey into the unknown.
It has.
We explored a theory that challenges how we understand the world and ask questions that don't have easy answers.
Big questions.
It reminds us that the future is not set in stone.
Right?
It's shaped by our choices, our actions, and our collective will.
It really is.
This has been a truly incredible experience, and I want to thank you for being a part of this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
As we wrap up, I want to encourage you to keep exploring this topic. Keep asking questions, challenge assumptions, and seek out different perspectives.
I second that.
The search for knowledge never ends, and it's in times like these when things are uncertain and complex that our critical thinking skills are more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep diving deep.